The tension on Flight 327 was thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers were settling into their seats, the usual pre-flight chatter filling the air, when an unexpected accusation sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. A flight attendant, her uniform crisp and her expression sharp, suddenly pointed a finger at a family sitting in row 14. "You stole from me," she snapped, her voice slicing through the hum of conversation. The family, a mother, father, and their teenage daughter, looked up, bewildered. The mother, a woman in her early 40s with warm brown eyes, blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" The flight attendant crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "My bracelet. I set it down for a moment, and now it's gone. You were the only ones near it." A hush fell over the nearby passengers. People glanced over their seats, some craning their necks to get a better look. The father, a calm-looking man with salt and pepper hair, frowned. "We didn't take anything," he said firmly. The daughter, no older than 16, clutched her backpack closer to her chest, her face turning red. "Why would we steal your bracelet?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. The flight attendant wasn't backing down. "I saw you looking at it," she said, pointing at the teenager. "You were standing right there when I stepped away for a second. Just give it back, and we won't have a problem." A few passengers exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed intrigued, as if they had front-row seats to an unexpected drama. A businessman in a suit shifted in his seat, clearly annoyed by the delay. A mother across the aisle whispered something to her child, pulling him closer. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that final checks were underway, but the confrontation between the flight attendant and the family was far from over. The mother shook her head, her voice steady but firm. "We didn't take anything. You're making a mistake." The flight attendant scoffed. "A mistake? I don't think so. You need to return it now, or I'll have security handle this." The threat hung in the air, making several passengers sit up straighter. A man in the back muttered, "This is ridiculous," while a flight crew member further down the aisle hesitated, glancing between the arguing parties. Then, just as the situation seemed to be escalating, a voice rang out from a few rows back. "Wait a minute." Every head turned. A young boy, no older than 10, stood up in his seat, holding something in his small hands. The bracelet. The flight attendant's face drained of color. The boy looked nervous as he glanced between the flight attendant and the accused family. I found this on the floor," he said quietly. "I thought someone dropped it." A heavy silence filled the cabin. The mother let out a breath of disbelief. The father rubbed his temple. The teenage daughter's hands trembled with frustration. The flight attendant's mouth opened, then closed. The weight of her accusation hung in the air. And then, just 6 minutes later, something no one saw coming turned the entire situation on its head. The air in the cabin was heavy with unspoken words. The boy shifted nervously in his seat, still holding the bracelet, his small fingers gripping it tightly as if he suddenly regretted speaking up. The mother in row 14 turned to the flight attendant, her voice calm but edged with disbelief. "So it was on the floor the whole time?" she asked, her eyes locked onto the woman in uniform. The flight attendant's lips parted, but no words came out. A flicker of embarrassment crossed her face, though she quickly masked it with a huff. "Well, it was missing, and they were the only ones near it," she said, though her voice wasn't as sharp as before. The father shook his head. "That doesn't justify accusing us of stealing." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, disappointment, maybe even anger. The teenage daughter finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "You made everyone look at us like criminals," she said. "For no reason." Passengers murmured among themselves, a mix of reactions spreading through the cabin. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed annoyed that the flight was being delayed over something so unnecessary. The businessman in the suit sighed loudly, checking his watch. The mother with the young child hugged him a little tighter. The boy, still standing awkwardly in his seat, finally extended the bracelet toward the flight attendant. She took it without making eye contact, slipping it back onto her wrist. There was a long pause. And then, instead of apologizing, she straightened her shoulders and said, "Well, it's been found. Let's move on." A wave of disbelief swept through row 14. The father let out a small laugh, not out of amusement, but frustration. "That's it?" he asked. "You accused us of stealing, humiliated my family in front of the entire plane, and you just want to move on?" The flight attendant's jaw tightened. "I was just doing my job," she replied stiffly. "I take security very seriously." A voice from a few rows back chimed in. "Security?" It was a woman in her 30s, shaking her head. "Security is one thing. Jumping to conclusions and blaming innocent people is another." More murmurs of agreement filled the cabin. A man across the aisle muttered, "Ridiculous," while a young couple near the front exchanged looks, whispering to each other. The mother let out a breath, pressing her palm against her forehead. "We should be getting an apology," she said, her tone no longer just calm, it was exhausted. The flight attendant didn't respond right away. Her grip on the service cart tightened as she shifted her stance. "Look," she said, her voice lower now, "it was a misunderstanding. Let's just focus on getting this flight in the air." The tension was thick, but eventually, people started settling down. The young boy's mother pulled him back into his seat and whispered something in his ear, probably reassuring him that he had done the right thing. The businessman sighed again and pulled out his phone. One by one, passengers turned their attention elsewhere, some scrolling through their devices, others simply staring out the window. But the family in row 14 wasn't ready to let it go. The mother turned to her husband. "She's just walking away like nothing happened," she murmured, shaking her head. The father exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable." The teenage daughter crossed her arms, staring ahead, her jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like that would be the end of it. A stain on an otherwise normal flight. But then, 6 minutes later, everything changed. It started with a whisper. A flight attendant, a different one, leaned over to another crew member at the front of the cabin, speaking in hushed tones. Then, the first officer, who had just stepped out of the cockpit, paused and glanced toward the back of the plane. There was a brief exchange between him and the lead flight attendant, their expressions unreadable. Passengers started noticing the shift. Something was happening. Then, without warning, the same flight attendant who had accused the family stiffened. She turned to her crew member, her face unreadable, before abruptly moving toward the front of the plane. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're handling a quick matter before departure. Thank you for your patience." More whispers. More glances exchanged between the crew. The accused family wasn't the only one noticing now. Passengers all around were watching, curiosity and confusion growing with each second. Then, just as quietly as it had started, the tension snapped into something far more serious. 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped onto the plane. A ripple of murmurs swept through the cabin. The flight attendant, the same one who had accused the family, turned pale. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The lead flight attendant approached her, voice hushed but firm. "You need to come with us." Passengers sucked in sharp breaths. The businessman who had been sighing in frustration before suddenly sat up straighter. The young boy who had found the bracelet clutched his mother's sleeve. The flight attendant's eyes darted around the cabin, her expression shifting rapidly between confusion and fear. "Wait, what?" she stammered. One of the security officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense look, gestured toward the exit. "Ma'am, please step off the plane." The flight attendant's breath hitched. "Why? What's going on?" The lead flight attendant didn't answer. Instead, she just gave her a long, knowing look. Passengers were on edge, exchanging bewildered glances. This was happening too fast. Just moments ago, This woman was the one calling out accusations, standing tall and self-assured. Now, she looked rattled, her confidence slipping away. The family in row 14 watched silently, waiting. The teenage daughter, who had been humiliated only minutes before, stared at the scene unfolding before her with wide eyes. The father, still tense, rested a hand on his wife's arm as if telling her to just wait, to let this play out. The flight attendant took a shaky step back. I didn't do anything, she insisted. The security officer didn't waver. Step off the plane, ma'am. Silence stretched. And then, finally, the flight attendant turned, her movements stiff, and walked toward the exit. The entire cabin remained eerily quiet as she disappeared through the door. No one knew exactly what had just happened. But one thing was clear, this flight wasn't going to be an ordinary one. And whatever had just unfolded, it was only the beginning. As the flight attendant disappeared through the exit, a thick silence lingered in the cabin. People exchanged glances, whispering among themselves, but no one knew what to say. A flight attendant being removed from a plane was not something anyone had expected. The family in row 14 remained still, processing what had just happened. The mother exhaled slowly, shaking her head. The father, still tense, kept his arms crossed, his jaw set in frustration. The teenage daughter stared at the empty aisle where the flight attendant had just been, her fingers gripping the fabric of her jeans. A man across the aisle leaned forward. "What do you think that was about?" he asked in a low voice, his curiosity evident. The mother shook her head. "I don't know," she murmured. "But I have a feeling this isn't over." The murmurs around the plane grew louder. The businessman, who had been frustrated earlier, was now fully invested in the unfolding situation. A woman 2 rows back leaned toward her seatmate. "Do you think she did something?" she whispered. Before anyone could speculate further, the lead flight attendant returned, her professional demeanor back in place. She stepped forward and addressed the passengers, her voice smooth but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. There was a personnel issue that required immediate attention, but we're working to ensure a smooth and safe flight. Thank you for your cooperation." That was it. No explanation. No details. Just a vague statement meant to brush everything aside. But passengers weren't buying it. A man in the middle row shook his head. "Come on, that was more than just a personnel issue. You don't just yank a flight attendant off a plane for nothing." A woman in the back nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Something serious must have happened." The mother in row 14 glanced at her husband, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it had anything to do with us?" The father hesitated, his eyes narrowing in thought. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it's strange, isn't it? One moment she's accusing us, the next, she's the one being taken away." The teenage daughter swallowed hard. "Do you think she was lying about the bracelet?" The mother sighed. "Maybe. Or maybe there's more going on than we realize." The plane sat motionless at the gate, but there was a noticeable shift in energy. The situation had changed, and everyone could feel it. Then, a voice from a few rows back spoke up. "Did anyone else see the way she reacted?" Passengers turned toward the speaker, a man in his late 30s with dark-rimmed glasses and a laptop resting on his knees. He adjusted his glasses and continued. "When security showed up, she looked shocked. Like she didn't see it coming at all." The teenage daughter nodded slowly. "Yeah. It was like she wasn't expecting to be the one in trouble." Another passenger, a young woman with a hoodie pulled over her head, chimed in. "That was the weird part. She was so confident when she accused you guys, but the second they told her to leave, she panicked." The whispers in the cabin grew louder. The mother glanced around at the growing discussion and leaned toward her husband again. "People are talking," she murmured. The father's expression remained serious. "And they should be. Something isn't right." The lead flight attendant reappeared, walking briskly down the aisle with an air of urgency. She didn't stop at row 14, but her gaze flickered toward the family, just for a second, before she continued toward the back. The mother caught it. "She knows something," she whispered. The father nodded. "And she's not saying it." At that moment, a ding sounded through the cabin. The intercom clicked on, and the captain's voice filled the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." The plane shuddered slightly as the jet bridge retracted. The murmurs didn't stop, but there was a shift, a reluctant acceptance that, for now, they wouldn't get answers. The engines rumbled to life, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the plane finally began its slow taxi to the runway. But the tension remained. The mother leaned closer to her husband. "This doesn't feel over." The teenage daughter stared straight ahead. "I don't think it is." And as the plane picked up speed, lifting into the sky, no one could shake the feeling that something else was coming. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. People settled in, but the tension from what had just happened still lingered. The family in row 14 remained quiet, exchanging glances but saying little. The mother shifted in her seat, staring straight ahead, while the father rubbed his temple, deep in thought. The teenage daughter had her arms crossed, still fuming over the way they had been treated. The whispers among the passengers had died down, but the unease was still there. The businessman in the suit kept checking his watch, occasionally glancing down the aisle, as if expecting something else to happen. The young couple near the front spoke in hushed tones, and the boy who had found the bracelet was now resting his head on his mother's shoulder, unaware of the tension surrounding him. Then, something strange happened. A different flight attendant, a woman with short blonde hair, walked down the aisle, but she wasn't checking on passengers like usual. She was looking for someone. Her eyes scanned each row carefully, her expression unreadable. When she reached row 14, she paused, just for a second, before continuing toward the back. The mother turned to her husband. "Did you see that?" she whispered. He nodded slightly. "She was looking for something. Or someone." The teenage daughter leaned forward. "Maybe they're investigating what happened." The father let out a slow breath. "If they were, why wouldn't they just say so?" The plane hit a patch of turbulence, a slight jolt that made a few passengers tighten their seatbelts. The lead flight attendant reappeared, walking briskly down the aisle. This time, she didn't glance at row 14. She looked straight ahead, her face tense. A few rows back, the man with glasses, the one who had first pointed out the flight attendant's reaction, leaned forward, his laptop still open on his lap. "Something's definitely wrong," he murmured to no one in particular. The mother in row 14 turned slightly. "What do you mean?" He gestured subtly toward the lead flight attendant. "She's nervous. You can see it in the way she's walking. Something's happening." The teenage daughter shifted in her seat. "Do you think it has to do with the flight attendant who got taken off?" The man nodded. "I'd bet on it." Just then, a soft chime sounded, the kind of notification only the flight crew would hear. The lead flight attendant reached for the intercom on the wall, pressing a button. "I'll be right there," she said into it, her voice tight. Then, without another word, she disappeared into the front galley near the cockpit. Passengers exchanged glances. Something was definitely happening. Minutes passed, but they felt longer. The plane cruised at a steady altitude, but the mood inside the cabin was anything but steady. The businessman in the suit finally spoke up. "Does anyone else feel like we're not getting the full story?" The young woman in the hoodie nodded. "Yeah. It's like, we're all just supposed to pretend that wasn't weird." The mother in row 14 turned to her husband again. "I don't like this." Before he could respond, the intercom crackled to life again. This time, the captain's voice sounded different. It wasn't just the usual calm, professional tone. There was something else there. "Ladies and gentlemen, We appreciate your patience. We're currently handling an unexpected situation. Please remain seated, and we'll provide more information shortly." A murmur of concern spread through the cabin. The father in row 14 tensed. "Okay. Now I really don't like this." The businessman across the aisle turned to them. "Do you think this has something to do with that flight attendant?" The mother swallowed. "It has to." Then, the unthinkable happened. A sudden, sharp noise came from the front of the plane, a metallic clatter, followed by a muffled voice. It was too far away to hear clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was upset. The lead flight attendant reappeared, her face pale. She moved quickly, heading straight for the back of the plane. Passengers watched as she disappeared again, this time into the crew area near the rear galley. A few seconds later, another chime sounded, and another flight attendant followed her. The cabin was now filled with a heavy, anxious silence. The teenage daughter gripped the armrest. "Something's really wrong." The man with glasses closed his laptop, his face serious. "This isn't normal." Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the lead flight attendant re-emerged, her expression unreadable. She stepped into the aisle, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady but forced, "we need everyone to remain calm." Passengers sat up straighter, eyes wide. The businessman clenched his jaw. "Oh, this can't be good." The lead flight attendant took a deep breath. "For security reasons, we will be making an unscheduled landing." The cabin erupted into shocked gasps. The moment the lead flight attendant announced the unscheduled landing, the cabin erupted into nervous murmurs. Passengers exchanged worried glances, some gripping their armrests, others pulling out their phones despite knowing there was no signal at this altitude. The family in row 14 sat frozen, their minds racing. The father leaned closer to his wife. "A security issue? That's not something they say lightly." The teenage daughter swallowed hard. "Do you think it's about us?" Before her parents could answer, the businessman across the aisle let out a tense breath. "If I had to guess, this has something to do with that flight attendant." The young woman in the hoodie, now fully engaged in the unfolding drama, frowned. "But she's gone. What else could be happening?" The plane stayed steady, but there was an unmistakable shift in energy. The lead flight attendant hadn't given any more details, and that silence only made things worse. Every second that passed felt heavier. Then, another chime sounded, followed by the captain's voice. "We understand you may have concerns, and we ask for your patience. We will be landing as soon as possible." He wasn't giving any more information either. The teenage daughter glanced at her mother. "This is bad, right?" Her mother exhaled slowly. "I don't know, but something was definitely off." A few rows back, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked around, his brow furrowed, then raised his hand slightly to get the flight attendant's attention. When she approached, he asked, "Can you at least tell us where we're landing?" The flight attendant hesitated. I don't have that information yet, sir." That answer only made people more uneasy. The businessman narrowed his eyes. "She knows something." The mother in row 14 glanced at her husband. "What if this is about something else?" Before he could respond, another sound rippled through the cabin. This time, it wasn't a chime or an announcement. It was the sound of a phone ringing. Passengers turned toward the source. A man in the middle of the plane, staring down at his device in shock. His phone, which shouldn't have been receiving any signal at this altitude, was ringing. The teenage daughter's breath hitched. "How is that possible?" The man hesitated before answering. "Hello." The cabin fell completely silent as he listened. His face paled. Then, he abruptly hung up. The businessman leaned forward. "What was that about?" The man's hands trembled slightly as he set his phone down. I don't know. It was just static. The young woman in the hoodie frowned. No number. He shook his head. Nothing. Just a call. Passengers whispered in confusion. A phone call mid-flight? That didn't make sense. Then, the intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. The lead flight attendant's voice was different this time. Tighter. More urgent. We'll be descending shortly. People scrambled to buckle up, their unease growing by the second. The father in row 14 gripped his armrest. Something isn't right. Then, as if on cue, the plane jolted, not turbulence, but something else. A feeling like it was suddenly shifting, moving faster. The businessman checked his watch again. We're descending way too fast. The teenage daughter gripped her mother's arm. Where are we even landing? But before anyone could answer, a new voice came over the intercom. A voice that didn't belong to the captain or any of the flight crew. Ladies and gentlemen, the voice said, smooth but unfamiliar. This flight is now under different control. A chill ran through the cabin. The moment the unfamiliar voice echoed through the cabin, a wave of shock spread through the passengers. People turned to one another in confusion, eyes wide, breaths shallow. The businessman in the suit sat up straighter, his fingers tightening around his armrest. The mother in row 14 instinctively reached for her daughter's hand, her heart pounding. The father's face darkened. What does that mean, different control? The teenage daughter's voice was barely above a whisper. That wasn't the captain. Passengers glanced at the flight attendants, expecting them to step in, to reassure them. But they looked just as stunned. The lead flight attendant pressed a button on the intercom panel, trying to speak, but there was no response. The line had been cut. Then, the voice returned. Remain calm. Everything is under control. But nothing felt under control. The plane continued its rapid descent, the pressure shifting in the cabin. People braced against their seats, their ears popping. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, and a woman clutched her husband's arm in fear. The man who had received the strange phone call just moments earlier looked pale. He swallowed hard before whispering, "This isn't normal." The businessman shook his head. No kidding. The lead flight attendant hurried toward the cockpit door, her knuckles rapping against it. "Captain," she called out. "First officer?" No response. She turned to the other flight attendants, exchanging a look that sent a chill down the mother's spine. They had no idea what was happening either. The teenage daughter leaned toward her father. What if someone's in there? Someone who's not supposed to be? The mother shook her head. That doesn't make sense. How? The businessman exhaled sharply. This whole flight hasn't made sense. Passengers started talking over one another. Some were panicked, demanding answers. Others tried to rationalize, suggesting maybe it was just a technical glitch. But the rapid descent and the eerie silence from the cockpit made that hard to believe. Then, the plane jolted again, more aggressively this time. The teenage daughter yelped as she grabbed onto her mother's arm. The intercom crackled once more, and the same voice returned. "Brace yourselves." A single instruction. Nothing more. The lead flight attendant's face turned white. She turned to the passengers and motioned urgently. "Heads down. Brace position. Now." People scrambled to comply. The mother clutched her daughter close, her heart hammering in her chest. The father wrapped his arm around them both. The businessman cursed under his breath, gripping the seat in front of him. The cabin lights flickered. The plane was dropping faster now, too fast for a normal landing. The teenage daughter squeezed her eyes shut. And then, impact. A violent shudder tore through the plane, a screech of metal, the feeling of being thrown forward as the aircraft made contact with the ground. The world seemed to tilt and twist all at once. Bags flew from overhead bins, people screamed, the force pressing them hard into their seats. Then, stillness. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence. The teenage daughter's breathing was ragged as she slowly opened her eyes. "Are we?" The mother's hands trembled as she looked around. "We're on the ground." Outside the window, the runway stretched out before them, but something was wrong. It wasn't an airport. There were no terminals, no jet bridges, no signs of a commercial landing zone. Just an empty stretch of tarmac surrounded by darkness. The businessman unbuckled his seatbelt with shaky hands. "Where the hell are we?" Passengers groaned as they slowly regained their bearings. Some were crying, others just sitting in stunned silence. The lead flight attendant unfastened herself and rushed toward the cockpit, yanking at the door. This time, it opened. The captain and first officer were slumped in their seats, unconscious but breathing. No signs of a struggle. Just out cold. The lead flight attendant turned back to the cabin, her voice shaking. "They're alive." Passengers gasped, but before anyone could react further, a noise outside the plane caught their attention. A low hum, growing louder. The teenage daughter turned to the window. "Mom!" A row of headlights appeared in the distance, heading straight toward them. Vehicles. But not airport vehicles. No one spoke. No one moved. Then the businessman whispered, "This wasn't an accident." The mother's stomach dropped. The teenage daughter exhaled shakily. "Then what was it?" And before anyone could answer, the plane doors unlocked with a loud mechanical click. The low hum of approaching vehicles sent a fresh wave of panic through the passengers. Every breath felt heavier, every heartbeat louder. The teenage daughter clutched her mother's arm as they both stared out the window, watching as headlights cut through the darkness, closing in. The businessman exhaled sharply. Someone planned this. The mother barely heard him. Her mind was spinning. The plane had landed, crash-landed, really, nowhere near a normal airport. The pilots were unconscious. The flight attendants looked just as confused as the passengers. And now, whoever was in those vehicles was arriving fast. Then, the unmistakable sound of the plane doors unlocking echoed through the cabin. The lead flight attendant spun around, eyes wide. "That wasn't me." The cabin remained eerily still for a moment before a soft hiss filled the air. The doors were opening. On their own. The father unbuckled his seatbelt, his protective instincts kicking in. "Stay close," he told his wife and daughter. Passengers murmured in alarm as the first door creaked open, the metal groaning as if resisting. Cold night air rushed in, sending shivers through the cabin. The businessman turned his head sharply as the second door unlocked, then the third. A tall figure appeared in the doorway. The teenage daughter sucked in a breath. Whoever it was, they weren't wearing any kind of uniform. No airport personnel vest, no police badge. Just dark clothing and an unreadable expression. Another figure appeared behind the first. Then another. The lead flight attendant took an uncertain step forward. Who are you?" The first figure stepped inside. His voice was calm, but firm. "You're safe." The businessman scoffed. "Yeah, forgive me if I don't believe that." The man didn't react. Instead, he scanned the cabin, his gaze landing on the unconscious pilots before shifting to the passengers. "We need everyone to exit the aircraft. Now." No one moved. The mother's fingers curled around her daughter's hand. "Where are we?" The man's expression didn't change. "I'll explain everything once you're outside." The father stood, keeping his body between his family and the strangers. "Why should we trust you?" The man didn't hesitate. "Because we're the ones who stopped this plane from reaching its original destination." The words hung heavy in the air. Passengers exchanged glances, confusion deepening. The mother felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" The man exhaled, then nodded toward the unconscious pilots. "They weren't in control of this flight. And neither was your crew. The lead flight attendant stiffened. That's not possible. The man gave a slow shake of his head. It is. This plane was never meant to land where it was supposed to. The teenage daughter's grip tightened on her mother's arm. Then, where was it supposed to go? The man's jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, motioning toward the open doors. Please. We don't have much time. There was something about his tone that made people uneasy, but at the same time, it was hard to ignore the urgency in his voice. One by one, passengers hesitantly unbuckled and rose from their seats. The businessman narrowed his eyes. And if we don't go? The man met his gaze without hesitation. That's not an option. A tense silence followed before the businessman exhaled through his nose and grabbed his carry-on. Fine. Slowly, the passengers made their way toward the exit. The mother held onto her daughter as they stepped down onto the cold pavement. The night was still, unnaturally quiet except for the distant hum of the vehicles that had arrived. The father looked around. Where are we? The man in black didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward one of the approaching vehicles. A woman stepped out. Someone with an air of authority. She walked straight up to him, spoke in hushed tones, then nodded. Finally, the man turned back to the passengers. This flight was compromised before it ever left the ground. The mother frowned. Compromised how? The woman who had arrived with the convoy stepped forward. That flight attendant, the one who was removed earlier. She wasn't working alone. A collective murmur spread through the passengers. The teenage daughter swallowed. What do you mean? The woman's gaze was sharp. This plane was rerouted the moment it took off. Not by the pilots, not by air traffic control, but by someone else. Someone who had a very different plan for where this flight was supposed to go. A shiver ran down the mother's spine. But we landed safely. The man in black nodded. Because we intervened. The businessman's expression darkened. Who's we? The woman exchanged a glance with the man before responding. Let's just say we work for people who ensure situations like this don't go the way they were intended to. The father's voice was low. And what was intended? The woman hesitated, then exhaled. That's not something you need to worry about anymore. Something about the way she said it sent chills through the mother. The lead flight attendant stepped forward, looking shaken. So what happens now? The man in black motioned toward the convoy. You'll all be taken somewhere safe. Debriefed. Then you'll go home. The teenage daughter looked toward the plane, then back at the strangers. But no one's ever going to know what really happened, are they? The woman's expression softened just slightly. You made it. That's what matters. The businessman let out a dry chuckle. Convenient. The woman didn't deny it. One by one, passengers were ushered toward the vehicles. The mother hesitated before stepping inside with her family. Her mind swirled with unanswered questions, but deep down, she knew she wouldn't get them. As the doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, the teenage daughter looked out the window one last time. The plane sat still on the dark tarmac, illuminated only by the convoy's headlights. Then, just before the vehicle rounded a corner, she saw something that made her breath catch. The man in black and the woman stood near the plane, talking in low voices. And between them, just for a split second, she saw the flight attendant who had been thrown off the plane earlier. Standing. Watching. And then, she was gone.